Hello everyone, welcome once again to an edition of Under the Macroscope, Skybound Capital's weekly podcast series. And joining me again this week from the Hong Kong office, Skybound Capital's Chief Investment Officer, Theodore Xu. Theo, great to have you on, and very relevant that we have you on because the talk of the globe in the past week or so has been a company called Evergrande. Some are calling it Evergrande. And in preparation for this podcast, I was asking you which is correct. And you said, well, actually, it's an English translation of a Chinese name of the company. And the first part of it is actually everlasting. And clearly, as we've seen in the last week or so, everlasting it will not be. Tell us more.
Totally. Evergrande is the second largest Chinese property developer in China. And it's not a young company. It has been there for almost 2 decades. It was growing from a very small developer to today's size. And very much of the growth that we have seen in the past can be attributed to the excessive leverage the company took on. The company is more than a developer. It is also the owner of top sports clubs in China, including soccer clubs, volleyball clubs. It has a bottled water business. It has an electric vehicle business. As you can tell by now, although the company has been trying to diversify into other businesses than simply property development, it lacks the focus. It was literally trying everything. And while I guess the wishful thinking was that we should not be relying that much on properties, unfortunately, properties still account for more than 99% of the overall business. So all the other businesses have not been contributing positively to the group at all. And property has always been the cash cow to subsidize all the peripheral business. So that is China Evergrande.
And what stress is it under right now, Theo? What has brought this on? You mentioned in your introductory comments there the gearing, the debt in the business. It's become too excessive.
Oh, totally. So the company, by different measures, are expected or estimated to have a total liability of over $300 billion US. And that is scary to a lot of people. But trust me, it's never the level of debt itself that breaks a company. Usually it is liquidity. And that is also the case with Evergrande. The company has more than 300 billion in assets. So it is not in negative equity. It's not like the 300 billion is a black hole. It sucks everything into the black hole. No, it actually has a pretty decent balance sheet with sufficient assets and sufficient liabilities. However, the growth was always built on excessive leverage, as I said, meaning they were trying to refinance every time when their loans or debt is due. And the new refinanced liability usually is bigger than the maturing liability. But what's interesting is, I guess everyone knows this, houses are not built overnight. And you can't even plan the building that perfectly, because as a group, Steban is also in real estate business. We know that well enough. Therefore, when the bonds, when the debts are maturing, ideally you need to have cash ready to repay. But when the company is banking too much on the debt and banking too much on the fact that they can get refinancing, they never had sufficient cash ready. Then you are cornered into the situation that you need to offload those properties. But again, houses cannot be sold tomorrow. And therefore, when the loan is maturing tomorrow, you don't have enough cash, you are in this overdraft situation or technical default. Till today, the company still denies that fact. Even though in the past 2 weeks, there have been several bonds maturing, the company has always claimed that it will be honoring the interest, it will be honoring the principle, and it announced it in public. But so far as we understand, most of the people who they owe money to have not been repaid.
And the shockwaves have been real in markets, in financial media, especially. What are the macro implications for China here, Theo? You know, you hear expressions like, is this the Lehman of China? What are your thoughts?
Sure. The quick answer is we do not see this event itself as a direct systematic risk to China. And it is by no means a Lehman Brothers moment to China for two reasons. One, property or property development is a local business, and that's universal across the world. You seldom see a national champion in property. Even though we said Evergrande is the second largest developer in China, its market is less than 4% of the total China property market. So it is not as big as many people think it is. And the property market is super scattered in the sense that I'm sure there are a lot more property brands in China than smartphone brands. So that's number one. Number two, this is not a surprise. This is not a surprise, at least to China, or at least to Chinese investors. Most of the large Chinese institutional investors have been shying away from lending or investing with Evergrande in the past 4 or 5 years. So this doesn't come out overnight. Yes, it is still a surprise to many people because many investors were thinking, unlike the company itself, that it is too big to fail. But as I said, it only accounts for 4% of the total market in China, and the authority definitely do not see it that way. They don't think it is too big to fail. So overall, it is having many impacts on home buyers, many impacts on supply chain, like the contractors who work for them who are not being paid in time. It also has a significant impact on all the investors who still have outstanding exposure, for example, the bond holders, the equity holders. I mean, the share price went down by more than 90% in the past month or two. Basically, most of the equity owners are already wiped out. So those impacts are big. But if we take a step back, looking at the macro impact, as you asked, on China as a market, no, we don't think there's any big systematic risk at all. And let me add to this. We talked about the assets and liabilities. As I said, this is not a black hole. And the assets are much better than the assets of Lehman Brothers back in the day, because the assets Evergrande has is not complicated. Those are outright, straightforward properties. And properties do have value. Yes, you can have a haircut on that, you have take a discount on that, but they do have value. And those assets are still worth something today.
So Theo, given what you've said, I mean, why is it, do you think, that global markets have reacted so significantly?
I think part of it is misinterpretation on how important the company is to China and how big a spillover effect it might have on the rest of the sector, the rest of the market. And part of it also has a lot to do with, I think, the fact that many investors, particularly global investors, are already getting very nervous before this on China, because we have seen so many different regulations coming out of China in the past half year. Different sectors were under stress, and we have talked about this in our previous podcasts. So I believe global investors are associating all these negative factors together, and they are taking advantage, in a way, of this Evergrande saga to sell off more of Chinese assets. And one thing leads to another. The market today is interconnected. So it's not so easy that you only sell off Chinese assets. It will directly be spilled over to other assets as well. And that's how you are seeing kind of a big drawdown in the market, led by this Evergrande thing. But I truly believe it really is not 100% related to Evergrande anymore. I mean, take US market, for example, in the past week, technology stocks were sold off significantly. It's hardly having any relevance to a Chinese property developer.
Yeah. But Theo, I guess a follow-up micro question then would be, how, if at all, does this affect property ownership trends and habits domestically in China? Does something like this negatively impact the sector? I mean, from what you said earlier in the podcast, you believe it probably will have a relatively small effect given the relatively small percentage of the market that Evergrande actually service. But yep. Do you see a change in behavior on the horizon?
We do see a change, but not because of Evergrande.
Right.
So let me elaborate myself a little. One, we said it was not directly a systematic risk, but it does have psychological impact on many people, investors, home buyers included. And the psychological impact is more across the board in the property sector. Obviously, investors are now getting skittish. Okay, if Evergrande is falling, what about the other developers? Are they safe? Can we trust their balance sheets, etc., etc.? And for home buyers, again, you can get nervous. Okay, in the past, I thought I was buying from the largest developer, and I thought they could deliver. Now I'm not getting my house. Will I be able to trust any other developer? Will I be able to put out my down payment and wait for 2 years until that project is completed? So those psychological impact will linger for much longer. However, the trend changing that I was referring to has more to do with the guidance coming out of the government. Again, this is nothing new. People just didn't take it seriously. The Chinese government has already been encouraging the country of not speculating on properties, not rushing into buying properties. They made it very clear in public that they want to contain property prices, but people didn't listen. When people see the profit, they just rush into this. They thought, okay, if I can flip the property, if I can take some leverage. Again, a lot of home buyers are no different from developers. It's just a difference in scale. They're smaller, but they are as speculative as some of these developers. So I think now with some of these defaults, with some of these hardship that we're seeing with developers, and more importantly, with the non-existence of bailouts from the government, I hope the market is getting a good education, and they should start to take the regulations seriously. And very much more important, I think many non-Chinese investors are probably not taking note of this, that China is now encouraging couples to have their third child. And that is a more important policy than possibly anything else. And containing the property sector or the property price is actually servicing that goal. They want to make sure that housing is affordable across the board. They want to make sure that people, particularly young people, do not need to worry about paying for housing. They should be worrying about their career, building up their career, having a good family life.
And bigger families need bigger homes.
Totally. But cheaper homes, hopefully.
Well, a call for circumspection, certainly. And as always, in our case, do your research. And fascinating looking at the signs that were there for many to see over, as you say, the last few years or so. So as always, Theo, great to get your take on these things. They get misinterpreted, as you mentioned earlier on the podcast, and sometimes cause unnecessary shockwaves through markets. So just good to get an alternative and rational view on the situation. We'll be talking to Theo again in the not too distant future on Under the Macroscope. Always good to have him on the podcast from Hong Kong. The podcast can be downloaded at Apple, Spotify, or the Google podcast platform for Android, and all past editions of Under the Macroscope available at www.skyboundcapital.com. Till next time on Under the Macroscope, have a great week.